I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today, which is based and focused on the changes that we've seen in the last 2 years, in particular, caused by the pandemic, the impact on ethics and compliance programs. And as we'll talk about in great detail in this webinar, the news is good. In fact, the news could be described as inspiring and encouraging because ethics and compliance programs based on our research have really risen to the occasion and helped their organizations get through the pandemic and emerge on the other end with, as our recent program effectiveness report showed, their ethical culture is actually stronger than before. So with that, let me address a few housekeeping issues. If you have any questions anytime through the conversation, please drop them in the Q&A box, and that's located on the bottom of your screen. We'll leave 10 minutes for any questions at the end of the session. And if for some reason we're not able to get to your questions, we'll be sure to connect with you after the webinar. And also, the Compliance Certification Board has approved this event for up to 1.2 CCB CEUs based on attending the entire event. So if you want to claim those credits, be sure you stay to the end, and we'll send you the certification a few days after. So with that, it's a great pleasure to introduce a very distinguished panel. We're lucky to have 3 CECOs with major, and we have a great deal of geographic diversity, as well as different industries and areas represented. I'm going to start with Scott Sullivan, who is the Chief Integrity Officer and Chief Compliance Officer for Newmont Mining, which is a global mining company. Then I'm going to welcome Stéphane Bernadou, who is the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer for Auchan, which is a major French retailer. Sorry about that, Stéphane. But with offices in other countries as well, including Europe, China, and Bangladesh. And Joe Henry, who is the Chief U.S. Compliance Officer for Braskem. And Braskem is a Brazilian company that is a major player in the petrochemical industry. And Joe is the Chief Compliance Officer for their U.S. operations. So, as I mentioned, what we're going to focus on today is basically how companies coped with the challenges that COVID brought to us, and how the impact of COVID is continuing to change the way, obviously, we do business, but also how we run ethics and compliance programs effectively. And I think in the last year, people have realized that there isn't going to be a return to sort of the way it used to be. And so what does the new normal look like for our 3 leading experts in this area? So we'll look at the changes made during the pandemic, what good looks like today, and what's emerging. At LRN, we like to try to look around corners. So before we do that, I would like to ask 2 polling questions for the audience. And one is, and Carol, I'm assuming that you'll run the polling here, but are you planning, or have you already made more of your program elements like code of conduct or policies web-based and interactive? That's a pretty overwhelming majority. And that's consistent with the data that we are seeing in our annual program effectiveness report, that there's a real premium on making things easier for employees. And let's ask our last polling question. Do you plan to start using a mobile app anytime soon in the future for all or parts of your E&C program? There, it's a little, we're getting 55% no and 44% yes, which again tracks with our research where I think that's probably the next big thing in ethics and compliance. But obviously, it's something that's somewhat difficult to implement. But so thanks, everybody. Thanks for answering those questions. And with that, I'm going to turn to our panel. And I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce their company and their role, and then give us an example of how your company got through the pandemic, particularly your ethics and compliance program. What we've seen in our research is that companies relied upon values rather than rules to motivate people and to have employees stay the course. And in some cases, I know Stefan was mentioning this in a pre-call, put themselves at risk to keep things going. So with that, Joe, let me kick it off with you, if you would. Can you briefly describe your program and give us some examples of how you used company values during the pandemic?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. So as Susan mentioned, I'm the U.S. Compliance Officer at Braskem. I've been there since 2017. And I worked at GlaxoSmithKline in the compliance field since 2001. And I'm retiring at the end of March after over 40 years in the industry. So, but as far as our compliance program, I think it's pretty well normal. Some of you may know that we went through a monitorship with the U.S. government after Operation Car Wash in the early 2010s. So we have a robust anti-corruption program. We align with our Braskem values. We have our code of conduct, our ethical decision-making, third-party due diligence, risk management. We are newly into trade controls and sanctions, which is kind of timely now. I've had that the past couple of years, and a great deal of focus on data protection and privacy, which is also timely now that our work lives and personal lives are becoming closer and more intermingled. So how do we protect that? We do general and specific training supplemented by targeted, timely communications. So it might be around trade controls. I'll be issuing one next week on trade controls. We have our ethics line. We do a broad range of investigations, including hostile workplace discrimination, employee theft, those sort of things. I am a permanent member of our Diversity and Inclusion Council. I heard that earlier. So the compliance officer sits on that council. We were on the COVID-19 crisis management team, and that's kind of going to lead me into where the values came into play. And we also support internal controls, both Sarbanes-Oxley and non-SOX controls and internal audit support. So I always tell folks in my company, compliance officer is a misnomer. I'm an ethics, risk management, and compliance officer. If I do those first two parts of the job well, the compliance part is minimal, and that's how I prefer it. As far as one of our values, Braskem has a value and along the diversity and inclusion. We've had it since I've joined and continues to be emphasized. And we briefly said, you are free to be you, no exceptions. So it's wonderful. We're an inclusive company, and it's a very collaborative company, very friendly company. With COVID, it presented some challenges. And one was, even as of last summer, what do we do about vaccinations for team members? Okay, and the thought at the time was we make them mandatory for all team members. And a majority of our senior leaders wanted to terminate employees who did not get vaccinated, even before the vaccines were had full authorization. So it's even when it was only emergency authorized. So let me preface this by saying I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I've had all 3 COVID shots. I get my flu shot every year. I've got my shingles shot, my hepatitis, my yellow fever, and I even had a Lyme disease vaccine. So, and I'm fortunate. I seldom have a bad reaction. Once in a while, a sore arm. But I know with the COVID shots, both my daughter and brother were sick for several days after taking the COVID-19 shot. So I kind of see both sides. And so I was able to remind the senior leaders that our value says you're free to be you, which includes the freedom of deciding what goes in your body. Fortunately, we were able to reach a compromise where if you had a vaccine, great. If you don't, we provided an alternative, which was weekly testing and wearing a mask at Brascombe site. So even that probably wasn't had gone far enough, because the policy they put in place was, they only gave you 1 day to do the test. That was a Tuesday. And if you were late or missed it for any reason, you got one strike and you got a written warning, and the second strike you were terminated. So again, I had to engage and say, no, we need to provide more than 1 day for testing. Emergencies come up with everybody. And let's make it 2 days for testing, and let's give a written warning. Let's suspend the person on the second instance and then terminate on the third instance. So there's striking a balance between the company's needs and our team members. That's what we call our employees, team members, our employees' needs, to make that balance so that we're aligned with driving the company forward, but we stay true to our value. You're free to be you, no exceptions.
That's a very powerful example, Joe, and I really appreciate your sharing that with us. And I know that during the pandemic, your employees actually self-isolated voluntarily in your plants to keep the grid going. And that was also an example of living your values. Stefan, if I can turn to you with the same question, if you could describe briefly your program and then talk about what you've done with values, because I know Auchan employees have also risen to the occasion to keep stores open for your stakeholders.
Yes, thank you, Susan. A few words maybe to start with about Auchan, because I think that many people in the audience who are US-based may not know my company. So indeed, we are a French-based company, 60 years old, family-owned, with a significant footprint in Europe, subsidiaries in Africa and in Asia, many sourcing offices around the world. And since the creation of a company by our founder, a Frenchman called Gérard Mullier, we have a key value around entrepreneurship. And 60 years after the launch of the first business in retail as a retailer, now we have around 200 sisters company in various areas, from retail to renewable energies. And this represents roughly 100 billion euros of turnover per year and roughly 300,000 employees worldwide. Just a few words about the company. Few words about me. As you may guess from my accent, I'm French. It makes a certain numbers of years that I'm in the business with a central thread around risk management, internal control, and compliance over the last 6 or 7 years now. In diverse industries, from insurance, logistics, and for 2 years now in the retail business. I've been working with teams all around the world, and that's what makes the compliance and all these topics really interesting. When it comes to compliance at Auchan, we have a very simple and pragmatic approach on compliance. Of course, we want to cover some very specific area, from fighting corruption, data privacy, anti-money laundering, competition laws, trade compliance, export control, for example, are part of let's say, usual content of our compliance program. We do have some very focused topics, like the duty of vigilance, which is a French law which requires companies to identify the risk which are likely to have an impact on human rights fundamental freedom, health safety on individual, and to any kind of risks related to the environment, both for our company and our suppliers. So all this is part of our compliance program. How we see things is to make really things as simple as possible. When we discuss with our employees, we want to provide them with very simple situation, very concrete example of the do's and don'ts that they have to cope with and to apply in their day-to-day activities. It could be our colleague in retail shops who may from time to time deal with public officials performing quality controls and make sure that everything is going right. It could be related to data privacy. It could be related to many topics, including topics dealt by top executive in some remote countries. We want to make things really simple. So in our discussion with them, we always ask them to focus on two things: protecting themselves, of course, and protecting the company. And in the way they are protecting the company, we just bring things back to numbers, protect the top line and the bottom line of our balance sheet. Protect the top line because if you do the right thing, if you select, for example, the right supplier, if you work in a correct way, customers will come to our shop. We will select the right suppliers, for example. And if you do the right things, we will avoid fines. And at the end, our bottom line will be pretty good. So that's the way we want them to have compliance in mind. We don't want them to have complicated laws in mind. That's not the idea. Over the last 2 years and the pandemic made things really complicated in our business because we had, as you mentioned, Suzanne, the obligation to keep our stores open because we needed to make sure that people could find some food, regardless of the country, regardless of their situation. And the pandemic made a dramatic shift between people who were usually going to stores buying their food. And suddenly you had a huge shift toward the click and collect solution or deliveries at home. This made a lot of changes in the way we are performing our day-to-day business in a matter of days. So what we realized at that time is that our employees were really committed to do the right thing for our customer. But doing the right thing also means doing the right thing in the way you are doing your business. And we had the idea to launch something a little bit different from what we usually do, because usually every year we launch an event which is called the Compliance Week, where during a week we share with our colleagues a lot of communication around compliance, how to perform their job, and so on. And during that period, some of our CEO in local subsidiaries, like we had, for example, in Romania, they recorded some videos where they thanked our employees, and also they insisted on concretely what does it mean for an OSHA employee to do the right thing. They provided a lot of examples of situation of where they could comply with the law by doing really simple things, how they could also comply with our business code and so on in very practical situation. And that was a great way from our execs to be part of the daily life of our employees and make sure that they could always do the right thing. Basically, they said, we need to face this situation together, stay strong, stay innovative, and please keep in mind that in any case, we need to play within our ethical principles.
Stefan, that's a great example of two principles in action that, again, we see in our research. One is people went out of their way, or programs went out of their way, to make things accessible to employees and to connect with them, not just say this is the rule, do it, but to say we're here, we're your leaders, and this is what our expectations are. And then secondly, just the way you coped and pivoted with the changes that came about, I think, is another example of good values in action and also good program management. So thank you for sharing those. And now, Scott, if I could turn to you on the same question, that would be very helpful.
Sure, Susan. So thanks again. And I think I can juxtapose a little bit with sort of Joe's company about approaches as well. So I would begin by just saying, like most companies, our program is based on internationally recognized standards, best practices, industry benchmarks. So we heavily review that and make sure studies like came out from LRN, we're always reading and reviewing that to see what we can tweak. I think the thing that really emerged for us in the pandemic was our focus really doubled down on what I would consider radical transparency. And so that was really clear, repetitive messaging, expectation setting, and signaling. So at Newmont, culture is really king. It really governs everything we do. So I always think, if you think math, science, English, history side of the brain, compliance is math, science. 1 + 1 + 1 = 3. You get into the other side of the brain, it's a little more touchy-feely, a little bit softer. It's hard to gauge, hard to manage. So it's a harder thing to do. And I think that's one thing we do really, really well at Newmont is we really signal clearly what we allow and what we don't. So we do not allow performance to excuse misconduct. And that is no matter the level in the organization. And we practice what we preach. So we've had public examples of exiting individuals from the organization for misconduct. We do internal trainings on that, extremely detailed. It's basically a sort of a name and shame approach. I think when it comes to the pandemic, again, interesting, Joe, the approach that Brascom took. So we went the other way. One of our values is responsibility. And so it's to protect one another. We exited a senior leader. We had employees that were also exited from the organization after the window to get vaccinated was done. Of course, you allow for the medical and religious exemptions. You have the process for that. We followed WHO and CDC guidance on timing and the status of the vaccines and masking, et cetera. And we also had regular consultations with availability for employees and some presentations with some of the world's leading epidemiologists. So there was so much social media. This is the vaccine. So this is what happens, or this is what that is. And so having sort of real data from one of the world's leading experts was something that was extremely valuable for us as an organization. And I think you'll understand in a minute when I'm saying why we took that approach. So really two complementary actions in addition to the vaccine mandate is we put a number at the beginning of the pandemic, a number of our mines in what we call care and maintenance status. So that is basically shutdown status. That was at great economic cost to the company to ensure that workers and in particular high-risk indigenous communities that are around our mines were safe. So a lot of indigenous populations had a far higher degree of susceptibility to more serious consequences from COVID. So that was a key thing. We also paid furloughed workers for extended periods of time long before any of the legal mandates were announced. And at the end of the day, these things are done really, we have a social license to operate. So our values have to be genuine, demonstrable, and sustainable for all of our stakeholders to see. So ESG, I would say ESG is now, it's in vogue, it's new, everybody's talking about it, greenwashing this, this and that. And the other thing, well, we've been doing ESG work for 20 plus years. We have a full dedicated team that has been pushing the envelope. And you don't think of miners as organizations that will be at the forefront of ESG, but it's something really proud that the organization's done and taking a real broad, full stakeholder perspective, and not just employees, not just shareholders, but looking at the sort of the whole kit and caboodle.
That's very helpful, Scott, and that's a very interesting and valid counterpoint. Joe's company had a value of free to be me, and yours had a somewhat different value, but you were both true to the values. And Stefan was focused very much on entrepreneurship and keeping the company engaged with its customers, which was a public service in a lot of regards. So those are great examples. Let's drill down a little bit further now, because all of you operate in different places. And as we all know, there were different requirements and different challenges around the world. So, Stefan, could you talk a bit about what you did to take on the additional challenges of the pandemic in your global operations?
Well, first thing that we did during the pandemic was to make sure that our employees who could not work from home because they had to operate retail shops were correctly protected with face masks and all the things which were required to make sure that we could protect their health and safety. So the first thing that we did at that time is to rely on our supply chain and our partner in Asia, reliable partners, people who have already been duly vetted, and we've been able to put a huge quantity of safety product into a plane and bring that plane back to Europe. And from an airport located in France, we spread all this safety product in our retail shop in Europe. That was the first key thing, how to make sure that our day-to-day business would run. That was the first key thing, which was really important. I wanted to mention that because it was something which was really, I would say, pretty unique, because usually you see states doing that at the beginning of 2020, and as a company, as a group of companies, we've been able to protect our employees very early, providing masks to them at a time where it was really hard to find some masks because in Europe, at least, when the face mask was not something so obvious. So that was a key thing, protecting our employees. And when it came to the rest of the safety of our employees getting a vaccine shot and so on, here we also apply the principle of responsibility, meaning that every employee is responsible and should comply with a regulation in force in the country where he or she lives. So that's basically what we wanted. We did not want to add an additional layer of company requirements. Just apply what is requested at the country level. And if you need time to go to a medical center to get your shot, of course, we will organize our working time around that need, because it is important. But be responsible, wear the face mask and so on. So during the pandemic, also we wanted to make sure that our key messages about compliance, that could be also related to health and safety, but other topics also matter. We wanted to make things really clear and focus on what matters. And what matters is to make sure that people are doing the right thing. So here again, in our communication, we focus on what people were currently doing. They were negotiating with their suppliers in order to secure the supply chain. In the way you are negotiating with your suppliers, how to make things sure that things are not going in the wrong direction. So provide key principles. Make sure that the key people from the legal department, from the compliance department, for example, are here working in a partnership in order to make sure that if something unusual is happening, we are able to answer, to get the correct answer to the operational people and make sure that they behave in the right way. And in that perspective, we also thought that the role of the management, the middle management, not the top management, but the middle management is key in those situations, because when issues are arising, if you want to be aware of that at the head office level, for example, you need to have this bottom-up process applying at the company level. And if you want to have this information, the role of middle management is key, because middle management is gathering a lot of information, a lot of questions about ethics and compliance, and they should be able to behave correctly. And in the pandemic period, that was really critical for us to see if all the trainings, or all the things that we've done through the years were working correctly. Because it's when things are getting tough that you see if the learning you've provided is working correctly.
That's an excellent example, not only of the question, which is how did you deal globally with the pandemic? And obviously, the company took the initiative where it wasn't available through governments to get the masks, but you made it happen. But it's also a great example of a principle that we see and that we've talked about a lot in our research, which is operationalizing your compliance program. It shouldn't be a corner of the legal department that you only consult here and there or you take your yearly training. It should be an asset to, as you say, middle managers and business people on the ground who are in a stress situation of trying to get needed supplies and maybe asked to make facilitating payments or do something else that would violate a rule. But by really being there and being just in time in terms of your advice and your resources, that's an excellent example of an operationalized compliance program. So thank you for that, Stefan. Scott, can I turn to you? Can you share some of your experiences too?
Sure. I think maybe before jumping into the compliance program piece of what we've done differently, maybe broader organizationally. So first and foremost for us, we wanted to make sure that everything we did was looking through a full set of stakeholder lenses, not just employees, not just the communities, not just government. So really looking at it holistically and making sure we're doing what the right thing was. So one thing we did, we had a $25 million COVID donations fund, very heavy compliance controls on that to make sure that the recipients were the appropriate recipients, things weren't being diverted. We sat on that stairco. We regularly provided news stories, tragically and unfortunately almost on a daily basis about examples and stories in the news media where things that were done had gone wrong. We partnered with public health authorities. A lot of the donations surrounded PPE, vaccines, and other support. So there were even basically wings of hospitals that had oxygen supply systems that were provided. So wherever the need emerged, we had this sort of heavy steerco that reviewed the request, and it went through sort of a rigorous process. On a little bit more of a small personal note, so whether it was the work from home environment or the shift in thinking not just about physical well-being, but also about mental well-being, really that sort of holistic view of thinking of the full person. So mental health through Zoom meetings, et cetera. And we had one of the little ones at the corporate offices, there was a benefit for gymnasium. So you could get reimbursed for gym memberships, et cetera. And eventually that was transitioned to the acquiring of equipment because it's still pretty much work from home. So it's basically a stipend where you could go buy a treadmill, weights, or something like that. So to continue your physical well-being. On the compliance side, almost overnight, as I'm sure everybody on the call is, it shifted from almost 100% of things to virtual. So training, investigations, audits, et cetera. And I think at the end of the day, as we said in the pre-call, we were really surprised at the lessons that we learned. And the bottom line message was almost everything we can do, and we do, can be done as efficiently, if not more efficiently, remotely than in person. So I think the way we watched, of course, is I think it was Joe that mentioned earlier, the hours extend, so your personal and professional life merge. So watching for burnout, overextension, how do you manage compliance team dynamics, ensuring that there's regular touch points, again, watching out for indicators of mental health issues and thinking about psychological safety for people who express concerns. We even trained our investigators on mental health issues, and we conducted trauma-informed investigation techniques. So we did that prior to some of the reports coming out in our industry. The Rio Tinto report is one that has had major impact on the industry with respect to harmful behaviors in the workplace at a mining organization. And we doubled down on culture as well and launched our first ever integrity baseline survey. And then we also did a targeted compliance risk assessment to ensure that we're staying on top of the things that we needed to stay on top of. We're working on the things we needed to work on and not those extraneous things. And then I would say just real quickly, lastly, we communicated frequently, and we communicated about our values and what we expect of employees. So there was no surprises with the mandate. There was no surprises with expectations for employees of what needed to be done. And it was a more human approach to things. And so you put out a lot of leader vulnerability, and sort of a felt visible leadership was out there that people could see. It was genuine, demonstrable, and sustainable.
That's a very inspiring example, and again, it tracks with what we've seen in our research. Last year, our program effectiveness report, which is still on our website along with this year's, we asked people how they did during the pandemic, and it was very positive, which surprised us. People said that their leaders rose to the occasion, that, as Joe was mentioning, he was on the COVID response committee, and I'll turn to you in just a sec, Joe. But E&C played a big role in companies, and Stefan's focus on operationalizing, and yours on meeting the holistic needs of the employees. I mean, that goes beyond just lip service saying, yeah, we care about our employees. If you're actually helping people stay healthy in their homes and subsidizing exercise equipment, that's clearly walking the walk as well as talking the talk. So those are great examples of how companies doubled down on really ensuring that their employees could get through the pandemic in good shape, or as best shape as they could. So with that, Joe, let me turn to you. I'd be interested to hear what you did at Braskem.
Sure, and I'll focus primarily on our compliance program. But ironically, before the pandemic, I had been slowly changing the behavior in the global compliance group by using technology. Our company, headquartered in Brazil, we're very keen on face-to-face meetings and interactions. So I was traveling to Brazil at least 4 times a year. And late 2019, early 2020, I picked up Europe and Asia, in addition to US, until we could hire another compliance officer in Europe. So, and I've been used to the technology because I've not been co-located with my direct supervisor since 1999. So 6 years at GSK, my leader was in London, and for the past 5 years, my leader's been in Brazil with Braskem. So I kind of used to it, knew it would work, and I was kind of moving them there. So this helped get it going even further. But some of the things we did is we made sure we had monthly meetings. The Global Conformidad, which is the larger compliance organization, which includes internal controls, internal audit, risk management, data privacy, we as leaders would meet on a monthly basis. I organized a regional compliance officers alignment meeting with my peers in Europe, Asia, Mexico, South America. Made sure that the U.S. compliance team met with our auditors in the U.S. as well. And I would have an individual meeting with the head of internal audit, just to those alignment meetings, and seeing someone face to face, right? Even through the technology. What I did locally is I ensured that I had a U.S. compliance team member on every leadership team in the U.S., whether they be business units, our industrial team, our commercial sales team, our circular economy and sustainability team, our finance team. And sometimes it was me, sometimes it was a member of my team, but we had at least one person there to share with them any information we wanted to share, but also to listen to them and understand where their concerns are and where their challenges were and what adjustments we might need to make. Pre-pandemic, I made it a point to get to each of our industrial sites and our R&D sites at least twice a year, once at the kickoff town hall and then in the middle of the year. Well, obviously couldn't do that anymore. And the town hall meetings with all of our employees at the sites was impossible. But we still were able to supplement it by meeting with the site leadership teams on a semi-annual basis. And similar a little bit to what Scott had mentioned, we did do a compliance survey every year. We're moving that to every other year. And our human resources department had what they called employee thermometers. So they put out questions periodically, just 2 or 3 question surveys. How are people feeling? Depending on what we were particularly looking for, and that information was useful. The last thing we did from a global system strategy, because we were under a monitorship starting in 2017, and the DOJ and the monitors are somewhat impatient, we were trying to build our compliance program, so build the plane and design the plane while we're flying it. So we've had an opportunity to regroup and say, okay, we have a robust compliance program in place, but it's not as efficient as we'd like it to be. And what South America does is different from Europe, Asia, which is different from US. So we launched a compliance system strategy project. One of my project managers led that project. And it was an opportunity for us to evaluate opportunities for greater alignment around third-party due diligence, global key performance indication collection and reporting, and also to set up a governance process for any new systems, decisions, and implementation that we're doing. I heard a mention of a compliance app. Well, we're doing an app in South America. Maybe we should have done it globally, and instead of trying to adapt what they have to the U.S. and Europe and Asia. Perhaps it would have been done better from a global perspective and been more fit for purpose and maybe more quickly implemented. So we've implemented that compliance system strategy and governance to lead our systems development going forward.
Thanks, Joe. I like how you tied what changes the pandemic made to what you were trying to accomplish pre-pandemic, which was to use more technology. And that's a good lead-in for our final topic. We have just a little over 15 minutes left. We do want to do a couple of questions. So briefly, I'm going to start with Scott. And the question is, where do we go from here? Let's try to look around the corner, especially for programs that maybe are just getting underway or maybe a little less mature than the three of yours. What are the really key areas to focus on, and what do you think the changes are that are here to stay?
Sure. Yeah, so I think it's pretty clear that remote and virtual, at least in some capability capacity, is here to stay. So the cost savings that can be derived from this are just simply too significant. So I think Joe mentioned it, Stefan did a bit too, about data analytics being absolutely essential to cover a broader set of risks and evolving issues. I'm really fond of sort of marrying behavioral science with data analytics to try to drive proactive employee behavior to the right side or to the good side of the force, if you will. And you got to really use your precious resources to target your highest risk. So on the data analytics front, there's a lot of organizations that I would kind of characterize. One extreme is George Orwell, 1984 meets Tom Cruise, A Minority Report. That doesn't work for everybody from a cost perspective, from a cultural perspective, an intrusive perspective, data privacy perspective. But there are a lot of opportunities there to find a reasonably priced approach to data analytics. It doesn't have to be this monster that you create that is building huge systems at a costly thing. There can be some real simple things you do. The one big concern I have about the sort of the pandemic and maybe post-pandemic or next phase of the pandemic environment is, how do you reproduce, and this is the one thing I have not been able to crack, the water cooler talk. So when we would visit a site, you walk past somebody outside the bathroom, they tell you something. You go into the mess hall and you hear something. After hours, you might play foosball or ping pong at a site and you hear all these types of things. So you don't really get to have those touch points. And I'm not sure how to do that absent traveling. So you can do focus groups and things, but I think there really is a challenge there of how you get that in-person connection to hear the things you normally would. I think from a compliance team perspective, we spent a lot of time boosting the profile and stature of the organization. How do we institutionalize and formalize some of the hard-fought gains? We really did jump into the forefront with a lot of other groups and organizations on the donation stairco. We worked on a formal BINC, which is our Business Integrity and Compliance Team charter. We actually rebranded the team, the look and feel of a lot of the back office functions. So there were a lot of things that you could do culturally that didn't cost a tremendous amount of money. And I think that's that, along with the transparency where we were publicizing cases, names, and outcomes, that's something that does not cost a tremendous amount, but it could have a material impact on your culture.
Those are great examples as well. And you've certainly been active. There was a fear in the beginning of the pandemic that programs kind of curl up and go away and become irrelevant. But certainly your examples and those of Joe and Stefan show that that clearly didn't happen. So, Stefan, let me turn to you. And what do you see coming around the corner? And picking up on what Scott said, I'll call it the foosball factor. How do you engage and try to compensate for the fact that you're not seeing people face to face the way you were? If you could address that.
Well, that's true, and I really appreciate what Joe and Scott mentioned previously, because we have to keep things really practical, and we really need to understand how our business is currently going in very remote locations. If we look at the last 2 years, for example, what we notice, we had a lot of travel bans. So we could not go to our usual remote locations, discuss with our colleagues, and get these little pieces of information which could be really interesting in order to investigate potential misconduct or in order to adjust our compliance program. So for us, and for me, especially here, it is key to be able to travel again, because some of our colleagues in remote countries have not seen corporate guys for more than 2 years. So that's not normal. We need to be able to travel again and meet face to face and create again this trust. So this is really important. But that's not the only solution. Traveling the world all the time, it will not be and will not remain a solution. Of course, we also rely on let's say, technologies, and we have some very practical things here which work pretty well. And that's where also we believe that providing some basic and common trainings to all our employees on every aspect of our compliance program is really key. We should be able to bring them some very simple, concrete messages which are adapted to their reality. Because what is happening in France is not what is happening in Romania, and what is happening in Romania is not what is happening in Bangladesh. All our countries are facing the same kind of issues. For example, possible corruption. That is something which is likely to happen. But the situation, the way it is likely to happen, is not the same from a country to another. So how do we address that? And in that perspective, we do believe that having our management clearly explaining what is expected and being able to provide concrete trainings via e-learning, via in-person trainings is really key for the future. We already have the tools. And of course, we will add some additional features with data analytics and so on, which will help to potentially detect misconduct. But the human aspect, the discussion, the exchange with people will remain key in our compliance program in the future.
Again, that's an excellent point. And I'm going to pull out one theme that was implied in what you said, and also what Scott said, which is that your risks depend on where you are, both in terms of geography, but also in terms of time. And one of the things we're very focused on now in our thought leadership, which is also what the regulators are focused on in a lot of ways, is that risk isn't a snapshot in time. Risk is what's happening today and tomorrow, not what happened yesterday. And what you're describing, and what Scott was describing too, is a very proactive approach to that to make sure that you stay on top of it. So thank you for bringing that up as well. And Joe, if I can turn to you for your
Sure.
input on this, and then we can do some questions.
Sure. Okay. I'll try to keep it short. A similar theme to what Scott and Stefan have said. It's very likely that we're going to be working in a hybrid model, which is mostly remote and some office time. Those face-to-face meetings, those opportunities to gather information anecdotally are going to be limited. So our outreach efforts are going to have to be stronger from a compliance perspective, so that we can continue to convince them that we're approachable and supportive. As Scott mentioned, the KPIs, what are they telling us? That's going to be important. How do we improve our collection, compilation analysis, and reporting so that we know where we have issues or atrophy that need to be addressed? We need to further embed ourselves in the business areas. Like I said, we've made great strides. We need to continue to do more of that. And in order to do that, we need to improve our efficiency, reducing our manual operational tasks so that we have time to spend with those business partners. So that's going to be key for us. And then the other thing is we're going to need to refresh some training for some unused processes and for some improved processes. Like we haven't traveled. So now we'll be traveling. We're doing expense reporting. We haven't been interacting with third parties as much. So the way we record and track business courtesies, we're going to have to do so. I'm seeing as that's opening up, there's been some issues, and we're going to have to help our employees, our team members, relearn those processes and how to do that properly. And then putting some additional focus on helping our team members make rational, ethical decisions and not overreacting to the emotion or outside events. Whether it be COVID-19. I mean, the challenge we have is COVID-19 mandates. The challenge that Braskem had in the U.S. is a lot of our plants are in Texas, and that Texas has a different perspective than the federal government. And so how do we remove those distractions, enable us to move forward and ensure we treat all of our employees equitably and fairly? So that's going to be the challenge. I think I'm an engineer by training, so I'm very process oriented, but I've been people oriented as well. And I think it's going to have to be even more on the people side, but using the information the processes tell us.
That's a very good way to start to sum up too, which I'll do in a moment. We did get two questions, and I'm going to edit them a bit because I don't want to put anybody in a position of having to answer with anything that could be proprietary or private. But one question was about whether in your code of conduct you're using micro learnings. And certainly our research and our most recent PEI looks at best practices emerging in training. And you've all given good examples of those, just-in-time training, and of course, shorter, targeted. Stefan was talking about people in different countries have different needs. But if somebody would like to answer the question on the code of conduct and let's burden it out to what best practices do you see in terms of training on the code of conduct in the new normal? I think that would be a good topic to start wrapping up on. Anyone? I can call on somebody.
I'll try. So I'm not sure I'd call it training, but I guess it is where we see particular issues. We'll put a communications forward. It's a brief one pager. Here's a reminder. It might be a link to a policy or procedure, and then a reference guide we might produce, and we keep it on our corporate website. So it's timely. It's brief. I know in South America, they've put some videos together, and we're considering using those this year. But that's kind of what we've done around code of conduct to this point is timely communication supported by a short, succinct, but informative document that's referenceable going forward.
Great. And then the other question had to do with what you're seeing in your hotline, if you can talk about that. Stefan, perhaps, or Scott, did you see a spike during the pandemic? Did you change your hotline? A best practice we saw was to expand the hotline into more of a helpline,
Yeah.
and that's what everybody's been talking about too.
So maybe I can go first. So we did as I mentioned, we rebranded the entire program, moved it from the tool or the hotline to the integrity helpline. More of a focus on asking questions. It's not just to rat somebody out or to complain about something, but also to nominate people for awards. So we do integrity awards on an annual basis. So a lot of work there. The numbers dropped fairly precipitously because you had less human contact. So you thought, what's going to happen? We also created a COVID category. Most in the beginning were questions about what am I going to get paid, or what's the circumstances of expectations around travel, different things like that. Then it migrated a little bit to vaccine issues and things. So you've had it kind of progress over the COVID cycle, if you will. But the numbers now are pretty close back to pre-COVID numbers. And as you're re-engaging humanity, you start to see the sort of the behavioral things that perhaps dissipated before. There were a bit more spikes in other categories that you would expect in a remote environment, but it wasn't something that skyrocketed off. We focused a lot of time on, did people feel comfortable going self-identifying versus anonymity? And then who did they go to? Did they go to the helpline? Did they go to their manager? Did they go to the compliance team? Where did they go? And then focusing training around those groups. So that was kind of what we saw.
Thanks. Stefan, any last thoughts before I close out?
Well, our situation was pretty close to what Scott just described. We made a complete change in our process, outline process during the pandemic, and also what we wanted to be sure was that every employee, just with his or her smartphone, was able to scan a QR code and submit a question, submit a case about a potential misconduct, and roughly, we did not see such a difference during the pandemic and before the pandemic. Of course, we had more questions about COVID, but the main questions, the main issues that were reported were the same during the pandemic as before. My only concern here, let's say, and where I clearly want to focus, is about the topic of corruption, because we've seen that during the pandemic, and many studies show that there was a decrease in the way that states and people control the topic of corruption. And we need to be sure that in the way people are performing our business in remote locations, but including in our very close country, that some potential misconduct have not appeared and they still comply within the line. So that will be a part of our focus in the coming months.
Well, and it's a good example of using a risk approach to.
Suzanne, we can hear you.
Oh, it's a good example. It's a good example of using a risk analysis approach to determine where you're going to focus. My apologies that my computer is not cooperating, but we are out of time. And I do want to thank all three of you. I can rarely remember a webinar where there was so much insight and wisdom offered. So I'm going to close out just by saying that we do have another webinar coming up on March 29th from noon to 1 p.m. On DEI. And we also will be sending out links to our research, most notably our program effectiveness report. So with that, let me thank all three of you very much for spending time and for contributing to the bigger E&C community in terms of best practices, lessons learned, and insight. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Bye all.